Hey, good afternoon, Tim.
Good afternoon. How are you doing, Merv?
Oh, can you see my shirt, Tim?
Yes, I can. Yes, I
It,
can.
it's one of my Aloha shirts from when I used to live in Hawaii, and my wife and I are heading on vacation. So I'm just trying to get into the mood. How's that?
Oh, you're doing great. You're doing great. So, how are we going to do this show while you're gone?
Oh, well, I suspect I'll try out the web. I mean the how well the internet is at the condo that we'll be staying. I suspect we'll be fine, and I'll just find a nice little waterfall maybe to sit in front of. I don't know. We'll figure it out. I'll check it out when I'm there.
So, you're talking about working remotely while we're working together.
I am always working remotely. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to be vacationing and working remotely. Perfect.
Excellent.
That's a perfect segue into our topic today.
And you actually led us right into that. I was thinking about this when we were putting together our script, and I was thinking, how long have I really worked remotely? And I don't want to say back in 2001, even though I was sending engineers out to the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States while I was staying in New Mexico. But I really remember 2004 because that's when I started formally teaching people on project management. And I'd have up to 50 people in a class, which is really goofy, right? You think about, the issues we have working remotely, right? Minimal body language, minimal engagement. We have to really step up as managers and leaders to ensure that certain things were in place. And I experienced this with archaic architecture, hardware and software. And it actually was successful. I was amazed. And it wasn't just successful. We kept that going until 2012 when I left my corporation. And then 2012 to 2013, I was doing a lot of face-to-face teaching. And then all of a sudden, the end of 2014, all of my training went onto the internet. It was the age of Cyrix and WebEx, and all of a sudden, we had Zoom show up, and now we have so many tools that these tools are almost transparent. So remote is almost not a concept, except it still has to be a consideration, doesn't it?
It does, and I think part of what you were just relaying is part of what I was feeling as well. I know at the end of last week's podcast, we kind of hit on the idea that why don't we do a program on the remote worker? And as I was kind of thinking around this topic and coming up with some various ideas to present this today, I realized, much like you, that in many ways, as a consultant, we were encouraged to be able to work from wherever we were. And so there were times, for example, when I chose to stay at home because I didn't have to have face-to-face client time, and I was able to work at home. And those were the days. I think Skype was the predominant remote tool at that point. And we became very familiar with Skype. We could pop in regardless of time zone. Many of us were across 4, 5, 6 time zones. One project we had a whole team working remotely out of, I think it was out of either Bangladesh or India. And from those particular situations, we just became very comfortable with it. So when the pandemic hit, I think for you and I as IT people, we were already fairly used to the whole concept. And so we slipped into it quickly. But I think what you and I want to talk about today is what about this last year and how do we come out of it and that sort of thing, right?
Right. Before we get into today, let's go ahead and start talking about that because you are talking about benefits. I want to give you a really good example of how we use this. I was part owner in a telecommunications corporation. And what we did was we'd go in, and when they needed an upgrade, we came in, and usually it was preparing for, at the time, 4G. And so we'd have to have the telecom provider basically turn off the cell tower so we could do our work. And this had to be prearranged. And even the federal government had to be part of this. And so what we did was we created a central op center, right? An operations center where we stayed in connection. We used one of the meeting tools back in 2012, 2013. I don't even remember what it was. And we actually created a meeting underneath the cell tower where our ops center and our team underneath the cell tower, and then our client's ops center was working in one meeting room so that if there were any issues, we all knew what was going on. So it was a very collaborative environment. And that's what was beautiful. And by that time, we had these wonderful 3G and 4G devices that we could connect a laptop to. Even if the cell tower was down, we could still get up and running and talk to the people who were there. From the time that the cell tower dropped to the time we were able to bring it back up and get it back into operations. So it was incredible for us to create a collaborative environment.
Oh, absolutely. And I think if we're talking now about just kind of the benefits to the employee or even to the employer, that probably has been precipitated largely by the pandemic.
Yes.
I think, I think there's some very obvious ones. For example, I think we mentioned last time, my commute from my bedroom to my office, if I take time to put my slippers on, is about 13 seconds.
Yeah.
So think about that. I was in LA just prior to the pandemic. And it was at 9 o'clock. We had gone out for dinner. Several of us colleagues had gone out for dinner. It was 9 o'clock at night. We were coming back to our hotel. The rush hour traffic is as though it had never subsided. There was cars everywhere. And that was at 9 o'clock at night. And I was thinking that those people who are working remotely now, one of the greatest benefits is that you're not getting into a car and spending an hour, 2 hours each way to get to the office, to spend time there and then come back home. So that's to me, that's one of the largest benefits of remotely working.
Here's another benefit. I'm talking to some of the greatest experts on the planet, and we're collaborating on articles, ideas, and projects and initiatives together. And I could never do that from if we had to work face to face. And again, this is something that we didn't think of before the pandemic. It's all of a sudden this was a happy thought to a lot of executives inside of corporations. To the point back in June and July of 2020. Publicly, CEOs were discussing the sense or senselessness of investing in brick and mortar. Some corporations, like manufacturing and operations, you have to have it. But why do you have to have it for your support staff? We were forced into something because we had a pre-perceived conception of a lack of control. And we realized that that was a perception and it wasn't reality.
Well, exactly. And I'm just reminded that one of the corporations I've spent a lot of time with, actually, I was a former employee and then have consulted with, when they bring on staff now, rather than onboarding them into a brick and mortar office, they send a computer and a desk and a chair to their home or to their apartment and onboard them over Zoom or over Teams or over one of the remote processes. And so rather than, again, expanding buildings to house people, they are expanding sort of the footprint by keeping people in their homes. And I think one of the benefits of understanding that is, you and I both went to college many years. No one told us that we had to go home and work on our assignments and keep our studies up. We were able to self-motivate to make that happen. So I think your observation about wanting these outdated ideas about control are exactly right. Because when we bring a college student on or a brand new employee on, we have to be able to trust that they will perform regardless of where they're situated.
Yeah, and hiring practices. Deming W.E. Deming predicted this. Hiring practices have to change, because instead of just for skills, it's almost more valuable to hire for these attributes like self-organizing teams, aggressive self-starters, people who are able to dive in, and even if they don't know all the details, they can actually start researching and building out their understanding so that they can actually map, here's the area that we're comfortable with, here's the area that we're not comfortable with. Even the hiring practices of corporations are impacted by what we've learned in the last year, year and a half.
Oh, absolutely. And I was also reminded, I was talking to my daughter the other day. She and her husband and our grandchildren live in the Bay Area. And one of the things that she had noted, amongst all of those high IT firms in Palo Alto in that area, many of them have their workers working remotely. And one of the unsung benefits of remote work is that they're able to move to quieter communities away from downtown, where there are possibly better schools, larger homes that they can inhabit. And from that perspective, there's another huge benefit of still being able to keep up with their careers, but live in a sort of slower paced, more comfortable environment, rather than being downtown Palo Alto or some of those areas. So, that's a huge benefit as well.
Yeah, satisfaction. And when people are satisfied, when they're happy, they're not thinking about other work. They're not thinking about leaving the company. They're actually thinking about helping this company move forward so they can actually be perceived as giving value back. There's a lot of benefits. It takes a change in culture, but that change in culture has proven over time that it's actually more beneficial for the organization, the corporation in the long term. And that's, again, I don't want to say Deming is fantastic, but this is something that Deming, as well as Peter Drucker, said was going to happen in the 21st century. If we can actually tap into this, and if we can actually create a working environment where people can be more comfortable, more relaxed, and they have a bit of control over themselves, they're going to contribute so much better.
Well, and just think of this: if I can make my office space how I like my office space, how many people, for example, here's another kind of untold benefit. How many people, for example, in brick and mortar get migraine headaches from the fluorescent overhead lights?
Mhm.
And suddenly they can set up a space with soft lighting and perhaps some music in the background that doesn't disturb the next cubicle mate. They can set up their environment that's much more conducive for the way that they want to perform. And as a result of that, they do perform better. So again, many, many benefits. But I think whoever's listening to us, the folks that are listening to us now probably understand those benefits. Tim, what about some of the drawbacks of
So,
what?
so this is what I wanted to talk about.
Sure.
We've documented that quite a bit, and the research is playing out what we assumed. It's this whole concept. Number one, management is not skilled to manage remote people, even though we understand that people working remotely have the same mechanical needs and expectations. Working remotely has some physical constraints. And number two, the employees themselves have a huge disability. It's called relevance. So when you first are working from home, you have this intense happiness and satisfaction because you're remote. It's fun, right? Bunny slippers and coffee, 5 seconds away from your office, and everything's perfect, right? And then you realize 6 weeks into the process that if I show up 5 minutes late for work, it's not going to disturb me. And if they don't tell me anything, I don't see anything from their curiosity or their interaction beyond just the meetings we go to, that there's anything wrong. And then phase 3 says, am I really having any impact? If nobody's giving me any feedback, am I having any impact on my work? And like it or not, if we're not making an impact on work, does anybody care about us? And this is what the pandemic showed. The workers who are working remotely are lacking any relevance. Do I have any meaning at all? Why am I going to work? Is it just for a paycheck? And this is where a manager can actually create a lot more satisfaction and therefore success, or they can allow this to spiral down. And there's two options. Number one, a manager can go into Theory X and put a bunch of checklists together. That's busy work to keep people, basically on track and maintained, or they can create an ongoing relationship. And the relationship is always harder. The relationship speaks to the needs, not just physically and intellectually, but emotionally. And again, a lot of us managers aren't tooled for that. And we're having to learn to be more servant leaders than actual managers.
So, so if I can interject here, I think what you just described was a manager who should have been doing that anyway, even when they were side by side in the cubicle jungle.
You know,
I think what's happened though is with the pandemic and with the remote work, it's exacerbated that, or maybe not exacerbated it as much as pointed it out.
yeah,
Because when you're all together, there's an easy way to do the cover up, like you said, with busy work, with, if I have a social interaction with my boss or my colleague in the hallway, I feel good about that because it's the social part also. And so as a result of that, I must be doing something that's advancing my career and that's also advancing the corporation because we're feeling good about being together. But now we're remote.
So the issues are multifold. The issues are the fulfillment of the emotional needs of the remote workers. And it's also the performance of the work they contribute. So we have two major negative impacts that are risks. Okay. How are we going to control those two majors?
I think there's several ways, and what I would do is put myself back in how would I control certain aspects of that, even if we were face to face in the office. But I think a couple of things. One of the things that we need to start doing in this remote work environment is we need to view our employees, view our team members, our colleagues, and even our customers and stakeholders. We need to view them as people, not resources. Last week, we talked about people feeling like they were just cogs in a machine or just mushrooms who were kept in the dark. We need to, I think this with Zoom environment or Skype or WebEx, I think all of these things now expose us in a way that allows us to bring people on board and make sure that we absolutely go the extra mile to make people feel like people and not resources or not cogs. That's probably my number one aspect of this whole remote process. Any thoughts on that, or any thoughts?
Yes.
Any other thoughts?
Yes. One of the technical recommendations I give managers is open up things like Zoom and Skype and WhatsApp and WebEx, open them up to social activities as well as to work activities. That's number one.
Yeah.
Allow your teams that time to bond socially as well as professionally.
Yeah.
Number two, train and mentor and train and mentor and train and mentor and observe, actively participate in the intellectual and emotional awareness in each and every person who's under your care, because they are under your care. And if they are not performing, if that performance is not up, you're accountable. This is, again, it's the team that makes the project successful, and it's the manager or leader who actually introduces failure. And it's
Well,
about building those professional relationships.
and what you also said, there's two things you said that caught my ear. One was train, and the second one was care. I think the second one kind of goes back to what I talked about. It was treat them as people rather than resources. But the whole idea of caring for your customer or caring for your team member, it's caring, but also showing them that you care,
Right.
that you're interested in what they're doing. Because with this remote, you and I are speaking to each other and we can see each other. So I can get a window into what's going on in your life if I were your team leader or your project manager. So much like that, if I have a Zoom call, whether it's one-on-one with a staff member or whether it's with my team, I can get a window into what's going on in their lives. So
Right.
if it just so happens that your grandchild climbs up into your lap to see what's going on in the Zoom window, let it go, because that's part of life. At the same time, there are ways to set expectations. There's ways to help people understand, for example, training also in the tools. If we're using a remote process like Zoom, my requirement for my team is that they keep their video cameras on. Because if we're having a serious conversation, a serious meeting, I don't want people multitasking behind their cameras. I want everyone paying attention. I can get in the meeting, do my business, get out of the meeting, let people go back to work with everyone paying attention, fully attention. So there's ways to set expectations. There's ways to train people, but there's also ways to understand that people have lives.
Yeah. And again, it's not care in the way we give our care to our families.
Right.
Um, I heard a great comment about 3 or 4 days ago on one of the podcasts I listened to, and they said, your project team is not a family. They're more like a sports team. And you care. You care if something's happening to them. If they're a star performer, and every team has the potential to be a star performing, and every team member has a chance to be a star performer, it's you who are accountable to ensure that they are actually up to the task. They have what they need to perceive this as well as do it. And again, to the best of your ability, this is what we can train and mentor in.
Well, and I tell you, from a management point of view, that whole idea also lends itself to transparency. Because don't forget, they're at home miles away from the office. You may be in the office, you may be remote as well. But there are things going on in the company, in the organization, that if they don't have a view into, they have no way of saying, hey, I'll volunteer to help you out on that. Can I get involved in that? Can I do that cross-functional team exercise with those folks? So you as a manager owe it to your team, perhaps even to your stakeholders, to keep them informed, to be totally transparent with them so that they can feel like they can contribute. Because after all, if they don't know, how can they volunteer? How can they offer their services to something besides the tasks that you have assigned them? And how will they grow unless they let you know what they're interested in?
Mhm. Very good. There's also something called recognition.
Yes.
This is something that you can give. And it's not just a manager who can give this. We know what a reward is, right? A reward is, here's a piece of chocolate, you did something great. Recognition is actually stepping out of the daily work process and saying, I recognize you. I see you. You are a unique individual, and we need this. This is something that without we expire. This is part of our physiology. We need to be seen. We need relevance. And this is totally within the power of a manager and leader to either give and help people flourish or hold back and let them just shrink on the vine.
And that needs to be immediate, and it needs to be positive. And by the way, you don't have to wait for the next Zoom call. If I get a report from one of my team members and they have excelled at what it was that they're performing, grab the phone, pick it up and call them, or fire off an email and copy the big boss. Do something that immediately recognizes that contribution rather than just wait for some opportunity at the next Friday's Zoom call with the whole team or whatever. So
Yeah,
that's important. I agree.
yeah. Rewards are upon an achievement. Recognition has to do with their behavior, and that can be ongoing. And like you said, it can be any time, without fanfare or with fanfare. It and this is what, especially during the pandemic, people are starved for. If you're a remote worker, you lack any relationship or relevance in many situations. And I remember, as a remote project manager, I thrived on my relationship with my mentors. Without that, I I would have been in severe isolation. I'd be living in an intellectual desert.
And I came across a little while ago a company called, I think it's Zapier. I think it's how, yeah, it is Zapier because it rhymes with happier. It was a company that started, I'm thinking it was 2011 maybe, but they started with the whole idea of they will forever be remote. So they never created sort of the brick and mortar process. Right now, from the latest that I've read, they've got about 300 employees in 28 countries over 17 time zones. And so you think about that, that sounds mind-boggling. It sounds very challenging. But because they were founded on the principle of remote ideas and remote thought and remote collaboration, they've been very successful at it. But here's the point of that company. One of the things that caught my eye was one of their managers, one of their folks said, don't focus on employees' output. Instead, focus on clearly communicating with them the expectations, clearly communicate to them their requirements for deliverables and that sort of thing. Show them that you care. I think we mentioned that earlier. And then set them up to do work that matters. So just by doing that, they were able to elicit employee contribution above and beyond what they could have done after a 1-hour commute into an office, and then looking at their watch to see that they don't miss the bus home at 5 o'clock. So again, the whole idea being, don't focus on output, focus on providing the environment for them to succeed. I love that.
Servant leadership at its best.
Yep.
In the early 1980s, Peter Drucker said that national boundaries, government boundaries, cultural boundaries are going to start dissolving in the world. And what we're going to start seeing is boundaries of interest, investment, and commerce, which is scary. These guys in the 20th century were able to predict so accurately the direction at which work is going to happen, and it's like they laid it out so beautifully. I'm frankly astounded, and this is what's going to have my head spinning the rest of my life. Do we actually see the rest of what they said happen?
Well, if I can go even sort of off the IT path to brick and mortar, I forget the gentleman's name, the flamboyant founder of Southwest Airlines.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things he did very, very early on was he created a triumvirate kind of workforce. So one was professional flight attendants and professional people who, this was before we could self-serve and make our own plane reservations. You had to call in and make your reservations. So he had one group that did the professional flight attendant and the professional reservation taking. He also had another group. It was sort of like a mother-daughter shared workforce, where some of the moms would stay at home and some of the daughters were perhaps going to college or seniors in high school, and they would share and work out of their homes. Before the internet, before what we have as Zoom and Skype and that sort of thing today, he outfitted them with telephones and their own kind of a way of getting into the reservation system so that they could work remotely. And he ended up with folks at home that were very pleasant, that stayed with him for years because they were so pleasantly helpful and so appreciative of being able to work out of their homes. So that was I thought that was very kind of forward thinking, even before this age of internet when things are much easier for us.
Yeah, and again, a lot of corporations can't do this. A lot of corporations have to be, face to face in many functions. But this is what we're learning in the pandemic. Here are the boundaries. Here's where we can really take advantage of, finding our perceptions that may not be true and being able to disassemble them and put together things that work better.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I will say, one of these things, we're kind of talking, I think we're talking very practical processes that managers can use and even employees can think through based on our discussion. But one of the things that I truly miss, I am a person who likes to collaborate with my team in a room, and I love to have my whiteboard behind me, because a lot of times a picture is worth more than 1,000 words when you start to elaborate.
Oh,
and what's
yeah.
even better is someone's drawing something on the board and someone comes up from their seat, grabs the pen and say, no, this is what I meant. And they draw something. So I think those kinds of quick collaboration that result in ideas and problem solving are a little more difficult, even with the whiteboarding tools that many of the suppliers give to us today. So there are still some drawbacks to this whole remote work, but I think we can get around those.
Yes, and we are. I'm actually learning from my students. I do little experiments all the time, and this is what you can do as a manager too. You can do little experiments and say, okay, we're going to try a whiteboard today. Today, I'm just going to take notes, and I'm going to start the notes. But if you want to take over and do the note taking, I'll let you take over, and we'll just watch the screen on the notepad. And so everybody focuses in not on a person, but on the ideas. And that's what you're doing with the whiteboard.
Yeah.
You're creating an information radiator that actually says, this is the focus of our work. And if you are wondering how you can use these remote tools, archaic or not, I was playing with these concepts back in 2004. Of taking quick text notes and then sending these notes as meeting notes out of my classes. And the students were incredibly thrilled. And so I had to learn how to type up to 200 to 210 words a minute to keep up with my conversations. But I tell you, it changed the engagement. All of a sudden, they were not looking at my face. They love seeing my face. And you're right, cameras on is an incredible benefit. But at the same time, having a whiteboard, no matter how simplistic, and having these text files, writing on the screen, drawing on the screen, and then being able to capture them, even though you think it's clumsy, if you can just start using them and then getting feedback, number one, you're going to see the value of the individual tools themselves. And number two, if you find out these tools are valuable, whether you like them or not, it gives you an indication of where you need to invest time in training yourself.
Yeah. Although I do have one colleague, I'm part of the National Speakers Association, and I do have one colleague up in Denver. He has learned, after doing several of these remote webinars or collaborations, that he's put a whiteboard on wheels. He has more room than I have in my office. And so rather than take up bandwidth. And by the way, when you fill your room or when you fill your screen with whiteboard, you miss out seeing people's faces. So he has now gone old school and he pulls the whiteboard in behind him. And even though people can't collaborate directly on the whiteboard, he's able to talk to them as he writes. And
Oh,
so
that's excellent.
yeah,
That
he's
is
solved
excellent.
that problem and kept and like you say, he keeps the interest high and people respond to what's drawn on the board. They
And
collaborate.
and this is how innovation occurs. It doesn't occur because you think and plan and make it happen. You try things out, and if they don't work, they fall by the wayside. And the ones that work, you keep on playing with them until you get them to a refined level. That's great.
And the other thing he's done is rather than, you know how you do PowerPoint and you share your screen,
Mhm.
and again, you lose everyone pretty much except for little postage stamp pictures. And then you have the PowerPoint, which is useful. But he's done the same thing. He pulls a television in from behind him and displays the PowerPoint on the TV. And he's able to still see the full screen with everybody's faces while they look over his shoulder at his PowerPoint. So again, old school, new technology, but it works for him. So we have to be collaborative. We have to
Yeah,
be innovative.
and you triggered something in me. I was a little frustrated when my advisors for my classes said, Tim, you really need to get a second monitor as a trainer. And now I'm thinking, how would I, as a student, be able to see everything I need to know? Almost as students, we need multiple monitors and keep track of these things.
Yes.
It's what was silly 4 or 5 years ago is now almost a requirement.
Oh, it is. Back to, I'm still intrigued by this whole idea, and we kind of left the topic. I'd like to come back a little bit, maybe explore a little further in terms of when we have those employees, those team members, maybe even clients who are at home working remotely and begin to feel distanced and begin to feel like they're not contributing. Any ideas, any thoughts on how else maybe we can work with them to bring up their spirits, to make them much more contributory towards what it is that we're doing?
Just like everything else in project management, it's all in the planning. First of all, we have to be self-aware and emotionally intelligent. We have to know the indicators of everybody around us. Are they pulling back over weeks and months? Are they self-isolating? Is there a reason? Why? We
Yeah.
got to be the masters of answering why. And then we have to actually train our teams to be in the same way. Our team leads have to be almost as sensitive and engaging as us, because no matter how much we do it, if the team leads are not working with the team members in the same manner, it's not going to help. You're going to be fighting an upward battle.
Yeah, one of the things that I learned and that I think is very helpful, which, and I want to be able to use this more even in my own collaboration with teams, is that there are times when you just need to set aside time in the day to check in, to have conversations about other things than the schedule and the output and in that. So perhaps if you catch something, and here's the other hard part. When I'm with someone in the office, I can very quickly pick up on body language, facial gestures, tone of voice. A little more difficult over a remote setting. And so I think in those cases, it's up to us. It's incumbent on us as managers, and as you like to call us, servant leaders, to check in, to leave space in the day or in the hour to say, hey, what would you like to do a year from now? What are kind of your career aspirations? Is there anything that I can actively coach you on off hours? Or is there something that you need from me to help you perform better? Just anything that shows that you, well, back to your caring, back to treating them like people. And I think that kind of gets them out of their despondency, if they are despondent, but also gets them into that feeling of being contributing valuable assets to the corporation and to the team.
And if you're doing that on a regular basis, like having one-on-ones, number one, it's not going to be unnatural to set up a meeting with somebody,
Right.
and you're not going to put them on edge. And number two, it's going to give you multiple reads. You're going to see trends in behavior, not just, individual data points. And so you can't do this with 200 people, but you can actually go around 45 people in a month.
Oh yeah.
And it's not having, established meeting times. It's more like being a professor and having your door open. And when students are not coming into your office, you should question that.
Yes.
This is my years playing in academia have taught me a lot that professors, if they're teaching correctly, have too many students for their office hours. And if you're a manager who actually doesn't have anybody for quote unquote office hours, are you actually creating the environment for the curiosity and drive and desire for motivation and innovation that you need in your teams?
Yeah, one of my favorite professors was the gentleman who allowed us to come in, sit in a chair, put our feet up on his desk, and ask about the problems we had, but also sometimes just shoot the breeze. And so I think, remember I mentioned that company Zapier. One of the work products that they've created is something called the virtual water cooler, and I think that's something. Get that picture of feet up on the desk, shooting the breeze. I think there is absolutely time in the day to create the virtual water cooler, whatever that looks like, to allow people just to let their hair down a little bit and enjoy the social aspects.
Correct. Now, I've done this in really interesting ways. I've had breakfast with my friends having dinner in India. And again, you don't want to eat during meetings, but at the same time, it creates a social environment. Eating family style is traditionally a wonderful social environment. And it actually breaks down barriers if that is what you need to do. Having breaks, we used to do it coffee in the cafeteria. We don't have time for hallway or elevator conversations because we don't have elevators or hallways, but we have time for just checking in, say, do you have time? Or when do you have 5 or 10 minutes? We have time for that.
And you just put your finger on something else. One of the things, and this is where we have to help ourselves plus our team members, being remote, being 13 seconds from your bedroom to your office, there is a tendency to feel like you have to be working all the time, like you have to be on all the time. And that can be disastrous as well. One of the things that I've done is on my cell phone, I downloaded an app called, there it is, Focus. It's called Focus Watch. Nothing magical, but there are times that I want to do heads down, and I want to make sure that I can focus and concentrate on the task at hand, because it needs that. Because the old saying, if you get interrupted, it takes 20 minutes to get back to where you were. So you've lost that time. But with Focus Watch, I think it's based on, and you probably know this better than I, Tim, the Pomodoro technique or something like that.
Right.
And so it focuses you for 20 minutes, and then it gives you a little ding at the end of 20 minutes. So you kind of finish up, and it takes you on a purposeful break. Good time to get up, walk outside, come back in. That 5-minute break is over. It goes for another 20 minutes, another 5-minute break. And it's just an incredible way that over a period of a couple of hours, you look back and say, wow, did I ever accomplish a lot? But without something like that, and people have different ways, you could end up working that entire 3 hours without a break, wearing yourself down, and at the same time not producing your best results because your mind does tire.
Well, and again, when you say focus, we go in with the intention to be focused like Emerson or Thoreau or some of these other creatives. And that level of focus is 120% or 160% beyond what we do today. And so when we say focus, it means you are 100% aware of being in the middle of the work and nothing else. And
Yeah.
that's not what we've been trained the last 7 years to do. We've been trained to multitask back and forth. Now, Ryan Holiday talks about this too. And I don't recommend this for anybody, okay? But Ryan says that in order for him to do the creative work he needed, he focused for 2 hours at that level of depth. And then he spent 2 more hours in his learning and his self-education. But that was his research. And that was part of the hours a day he did. So that's 4 hours.
Mhm.
And then he had messages, and he left a half hour to interact with people for unplanned communications. And then 2 times during the day, breaking out for 15 minutes seemed to be a good pattern for him. And he's writing, he's collaborating, he's engaging with clients, he's going to seminars, he's also just opened a bookstore. This guy's all over the map. Now, with our work, I think a great place, people who are thinking of how can I learn time management when I don't have anybody looking, is creating that 8 to 5 time box and then playing with Pomodoro and giving yourself time for, number one, those 15-minute breaks twice a day, plus maybe a half hour to an hour of lunch.
Well, and then take that next step further. You as a manager, as you get to know your team, think through how they like to work. For example, I am a morning person. So if I begin my day at 6 a.m. and work till 10 fairly steadily, I can get as much done in those 4 hours as many people get done in perhaps 2 days because of all of the other interruptions. And so I
Correct.
think as managers, we get to know our team and we set up when we create our meetings or when we create our interruption time, we do it when they're less productive than during their most productive time. And again, that shows that we care, it shows that we're aware, and it gives them the feeling of control of their day as opposed to having so many interruptions.
And get having control or a little bit of control over my environment is one of those things that give people satisfaction. And it's not just your team members, it's you too.
Yeah.
Again, I talk to a lot of clients, and when they say, I don't have time for you, it's that I don't know how to manage my time. And I'm in a continual crisis. And so, this is something that we have to retrain ourselves constantly as well.
So maybe the pandemic and this whole remote thing is going to actually help us in that regard.
Well, like you said, there is a continuing issue, and the pandemic has taken away a lot of the things that we thought caused that issue, and it's exposing opportunities as well as the issues themselves. Now, we still have that sense of isolation that we have to overcome. But again, we have, the isolation even when you go to the office. It, like you said, it's just, it's more evident when you don't travel out of your house.
Well, and we've been talking a fair amount of some of the disadvantages of being isolated, of remotely working. What are some of the techniques that you use personally to sort of get over some of those disadvantages in your own work life?
Like I said, it's the creation of the work when you're most capable of it. And you
Yeah.
you you talked about that very eloquently. Number two, it's creating expectations around what's realistic for me to contribute. And it's building in the social activities around the work I'm producing. For instance, effective meetings. If if my meetings don't go to a point, it's not the right meeting and I don't belong there. If people don't bring what they need to the meetings, and that includes me, that meeting does not have to occur. That's not the right time for that meeting.
Yeah.
And we have to change our mindsets. It's not necessarily the processes. The processes are so important. They're still important, but the objective of the processes is why they're important. Our meetings, our interaction with our team members and the people who report into us, our social awareness, all of these are down for a very few objectives. Number one, profitability. Number two, there's always an objective. And number three, there's safety, a little bit of control, and there's the whole concept of fulfillment. We have not talked about that yet either.
Yeah, that's true.
Um,
I
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was reminded, a colleague of mine talked about the fact that so many people are complaining about Zoom fatigue.
Mhm.
And he challenged me, not directly, but in what the next words he said, challenged me to now start exploring my own process. And then he said, if you feel there's Zoom fatigue, it's because you're not keeping the Zoom meetings or webinars interesting. If you
Yes.
keep them interesting and if you keep people involved, however that is, our society, our TV society has challenged or has trained us that we need a break every 5 to 7 minutes. It's called a commercial. Similar to a webinar, similar to a meeting, you need every 5 to 7 minutes something to get people back involved and avoid that Zoom fatigue. So yeah, he challenged me to take care of one of those huge disadvantages of remote learning or remote work that people complain about, which
Yeah.
is Zoom fatigue.
And on top of that, the objective itself. Why?
Yeah.
It's like planning a trip. If you have a real purpose to driving across the Midwest of the United States, you're not going to miss, the mountains. You're gonna be okay because you're going to have something incredible at the end.
Yeah.
So it's the objective. So the Zoom fatigue, or the fatigue of being in a car for 3 days for 8 hours a day, is irrelevant if the objective is meaningful. And that's what a leader and a manager has total control over. It's this vision, it's the objective that we can actually give people this reason why we're having to be in these meetings. Boy, this is powerful.
And I'm going to tell you one more thing that I've done recently. I think I see our time is winding down. Last year when this hit, and then this year again, I put a garden in. I can actually look out my window and see my garden. And so when I get to the point where something is overwhelming and I need thinking time, I walk out to my garden. I pick a few weeds. I enjoy the beets growing or the radishes. And it's something that is satisfying in a way that then when I get back to my desk, I'm re-energized. I don't know what it
Yes.
is. I have no idea, but it works. Just something else that you enjoy that distracts you from what could become mundane.
Excellent. Excellent. Wow. So we've talked about the disadvantages, advantages, the great intellectual and emotional exploration that we've all had in this experience for the last 16 months.
Yeah.
I think we're good with this topic. What is there anything else that you can add?
I think just just a very, very practical things, especially for people who are listening to us who are not necessarily even managers, workers. When it comes time for lunch, how many times do we, because we're at home, go to the kitchen, make a sandwich, and keep going? No, go to the kitchen, make a sandwich, and walk outside. Do something
Exactly.
else. We need those breaks. We need life to happen, not just always work. Because if you're working remote and bosses whatever you do, don't expect your staff to be on all the time. You are not calling them at 9 o'clock at night. That is not correct, just because they're home and working. So I think there's also that whole idea of setting boundaries and making it work for yourself.
Very good.
How about
Very
yourself?
good.
Any last thoughts?
I think I've stated it all. Really, it's like you said earlier, it has to do with, understanding how humans behave and think and act, and then understanding that the differences are not in people when we work remotely.
Yeah.
It's actually the environment that changes. If we consider the environment, then all we have to do is change our responses to the environment and still do what's right for the people.
Yes. And by the way, our stakeholders are just as prone to Zoom fatigue, or whatever we want to call it, and isolation using the remote work process as we are. So we should be treating our stakeholders, our clients, just as well as we treat our team members and our colleagues.
Very good. Very good.
Well, this has been good. I've enjoyed this.
Yes.
I've learned something.
Boy, have we both. Thank you so much for this. Let's talk about this over the next 2 days, about what we want to talk about. We have so many topics, and I don't know how to prioritize. But let's consider how we're going to work with that.
Sounds good. Where can we find you during the week, Tim?
Well, right now I'm on LinkedIn, and that's the easiest way to find me. I am going to be entering Twitter Space within the next 2 weeks, and you'll be able to catch me up there too. But that's primarily where you can interact with me.
And me likewise. So Merv Jersak at LinkedIn, Timothy Jerome. Is it Tim Jerome at LinkedIn or Timothy Jerome?
Tim Jerome.
Tim Jerome at LinkedIn. So yeah, you can look us up both there. We value your contributions. We value your questions, perhaps even some comments and responses to this particular podcast. And if you have ideas of your own from your own experience, feel free to hit the comments when this comes out onto the YouTube channel.
Thank you so much, Merv. It's always a pleasure to be working with you.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And have a great day.
You too.